At my husband Richard's funeral, they called him a saint. The word, spoken in hushed and reverent tones, hung in the air, as thick and cloying as the scent of the white lilies suffocating the grand hall. Mayor Thompson, a man whose political campaigns Richard had generously funded for decades, stood by the massive stone fireplace, his voice resonating with practiced solemnity as he recounted tales of Richard's unwavering civic duty, his quiet philanthropy, his role as a pillar of our community in Havenwood. I watched the heads around him, a sea of black and grey, nod in solemn agreement. A pillar. That's what he was. A great unshakable column of marble holding up the portico of our small town's respectable society. No one ever thought to look closely at the marble, to see the fine hairline cracks, to wonder what rot might be festering within. I stood by the bay window, a glass of sherry I hadn't touched growing warm in my hand. The light of a pale Oregon afternoon filtered through the glass, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, tiny golden spirits in the oppressive silence of the room. From here, I could see the manicured lawn sweeping down to the weeping willows Richard had planted the year we were married. Their branches swayed in the gentle breeze, weeping for him. Everything was weeping for him, it seemed. Everything except for me. My throat was a desert, parched with unspoken words. I wanted to scream. I wanted to walk to the center of this room, into the midst of all this polite, performative grief, and tell them about the man whose memory they were honoring. I wanted to tell them what a pillar. He truly was a pillar, in a prison of his own making, a prison he had locked me in for 60 years. But my throat was clogged with the dust of decades of secrets, my lips sealed shut with the sticky residue of complicity. So I nodded, a porcelain doll of a widow, my painted-on smile of sorrow beginning to crack. I wasn't grieving the man they knew. I was grieving the woman I had never been allowed to become. My daughter, Sarah, drifted through the crowd, her face a mask of elegant tragedy. She was a masterpiece of controlled grief, dabbing at her dry eyes with a delicate lace handkerchief. She had my posture, my way of holding my chin just so, but she had Richard's eye school, discerning and expert at seeing only what they wished to see. I watched her accept a condolence from Mrs. Gable, the church organist, and her voice, when she replied, was as smooth and sorrowful as a cello's lament. But I knew Sarah. I knew the steel in her spine, the same alloy of pride and denial I had hammered into her myself over the years. She wasn't weeping for the father she had lost. She was weeping for the pristine portrait of our family that now had an irreparable fracture in it, a jagged line that threatened the whole canvas, a fracture named Emma. David, my son-in-law, stood beside her, looking lost. He was a good man, a simple man, and he had loved Richard in the straightforward way a son-in-law is supposed to love a formidable father-in-law, with a mixture of respect and fear. Now, he just looked like a ship that had lost its anchor, adrift in a sea of social niceties he didn't know how to navigate. His hand rested on Sarah's back, a gesture of support, but she was the one holding them both upright. She always was. The name, the one name that was on all of our minds, remained unspoken. It was a ghost in the room, its presence felt in the careful conversational gaps, in the way people's eyes would flicker towards me and Sarah and then quickly away. Emma. Her absence was a shout in the cathedral of whispers. It was my cousin Martha, a kind, hopelessly clueless woman with more heart than sense, who finally dared to give the ghost a voice. She bustled over to me, her face flushed with sympathy, patting my arm with a damp hand. "Evelyn, it's a beautiful send-off, truly. Richard would have been so proud," she said, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. The flowers, the music, just perfect. But where is little Emma? I've been looking all over for her. I was so hoping to see her. The name dropped into the polite murmur of the room like a stone in a still pond. The ripples spread instantly. I saw David flinch. Sarah, who had drifted closer to us, went perfectly rigid. The lace handkerchief froze halfway to her face. For a heartbeat, the air crackled with a silence far more profound than the one that had reigned before. "Emma," Sarah said, and her voice was brittle, like thin ice stretched over a deep, dark lake. She isn't well." She paused, searching for a more plausible lie. She had a prior engagement. Out of state. One she simply couldn't break. An engagement. A prior engagement more important than her own grandfather's funeral. The lie was so thin, it was transparent, an insult to Martha's intelligence and to everyone within earshot who knew or suspected. The truth was far more complicated. Martha's kind face clouded with confusion. She knew the girl had been troubled, that there had been a rift for years. But this level of disrespect was beyond her comprehension. She looked from Sarah's stiff face to my impassive one, and whatever question she had died on her lips, she knew better than to push. The social contract of our small town was built on not pushing, on accepting the public story and ignoring the private truth. "Oh," Martha said, her voice small. "Oh, I see. Well, please give her my love." She squeezed my arm again, a little too tightly, and then bustled away, leaving a pocket of cold, uncomfortable air in her wake. I turned my gaze back to the window, to the weeping willows. They were the first thing Richard and I planted here. For our family, he had said. His arm around my shoulders. To grow strong and deep roots, just like us. I had believed him. I had tended those roots, watered them with my devotion, nourished them with my silence. I had done everything he asked, and in return, he had poisoned the soil. My right hand, hidden in the folds of my black wool dress, tightened its grip. My fingers traced the familiar contours of the small leather-bound book I had taken from his office safe. It wasn't a prayer book, though its size and worn cover might suggest it. The leather was smooth, the corners soft from age, but it felt as heavy as a block of lead against my thigh. It didn't look like a weapon, but it was. It was the truest testament to Richard Miller's life. Not the eulogies or the praise from the mayor, but the neat, precise columns of script inside. The dates, the initials, the cold, transactional numbers. It was his confession, his devil's ledger, the final, damning accounting of a sainted man. And now, it was my burden, my secret, my judgment to deliver. The sherry glass trembled in my other hand, and I finally set it down. The untouched amber liquid, a perfect symbol of the bitter truth I could no longer swallow. The reception would go on for another hour. Another hour of lies and empty platitudes, and I would stand here and play my part, the grieving widow, while the real truth burned a hole in my pocket, waiting. A mourner, one of Richard's partners from the old firm, was talking about the rose garden, about how Richard had the most spectacular blooms in all of Havenwood. My gaze drifted past the weeping willows, past the sombre faces reflected in the glass, and settled on the distant, thorny tangle of the rose bushes. The memory, unbidden and unwelcome, ambushed me. It came not as a gentle fog, but as a blinding glare, sharp and sun-drenched, pulling me back through 15 years of cold winters to one specific summer afternoon. Before the silence, there was sunlight, an ocean of it, and in that ocean, my granddaughter was drowning, and I was the one telling her how beautiful the water was. I remember watching them from the kitchen window, my hands submerged in a sink of soapy water. Out in the garden, the world was painted in vibrant, impossible colours. The lawn was a deep, lush green, the sky a piercing, cloudless blue. Richard was on his knees in the rich, dark soil of his rose beds. And beside him was Emma. She was 12 that summer, a creature made of light and air, with sunshine tangled in her honey-blonde hair and dirt smudged on her freckled nose. She wore cut-off denim shorts and a yellow t-shirt, and her knees were scuffed from a childhood spent climbing trees and chasing butterflies. Her laughter, a sound like wind chimes, carried on the warm air and into the kitchen, and I remember smiling. I thought it was the most beautiful sound in the world. He called her his little songbird. He said her laughter was his favorite music. That afternoon he was teaching her how to care for the roses, a task he entrusted to no one else, not even me. He treated it like a sacred rite. I watched as his strong, tanned hands, the same hands that could command a boardroom or steer a sailboat through a squall, gently guided hers. He showed her how to find the precise point on a stem to make a cut, how to prune the deadheads to encourage new life. "You see, songbird," I could hear his voice, a low, affectionate murmur. "You have to be decisive. You can't be afraid to cut away the parts that are dying. That's the only way new buds can form." She was completely captivated, her brow furrowed in concentration as she mimicked his actions with the small shears he had bought especially for her. To me, standing at the window, it was a portrait of perfect idyllic love. The wise, patient grandfather passing down his knowledge to his adoring heir. The very image of legacy, of continuity, a blessing. Now, as the memory plays behind my eyes in this suffocating room, the scene is tainted. Every gesture is suspect. Every word is laced with poison. I see him reach out to brush a stray leaf from her cheek, but his fingers don't just flick it away. They linger, tracing the delicate line of her jaw for a fraction of a second too long. His hand then settles on the back of her neck, just below her ponytail, and he gives it a little squeeze. "That's my girl," he said. I see it now, the way her small shoulders tensed for just a moment under his touch, a barely perceptible flicker, before she relaxed again into his praise. At the time, I saw only a gesture of grandfatherly pride. Now, I see a brand, a claim being staked in plain sight. The memory sharpens. He is leading her to the trellis at the back of the garden, where the climbing roses grew, a riot of deep, velvety crimson. "This one is our special project, songbird," he murmured, his voice even lower now, meant only for her. "The Don Juan. A bit temperamental, this one. It needs a special touch. No one else knows how to care for it quite like we do. It'll be our little secret." "One." Emma beamed at him, her face alight with the fierce pride of being chosen, of sharing a secret with this powerful, wonderful man who was the center of her world. A secret. He was so good at secrets. He built our entire life upon them, great, load-bearing walls of them. And he was teaching her how to be a keeper of them, too. He was showing her that secrets between them were special, a mark of her importance. He was isolating her right in front of my eyes. And where was I in this carefully crafted memory? I was the guardian of the illusion. I finished the dishes, dried my hands on my apron, and took the pitcher of fresh lemonade from the refrigerator. I arranged a plate of oatmeal raisin, Cookiesh's favorite, and carried the tray out into the blinding sunlight. The heat was a physical presence, wrapping around me like a blanket. The air smelled of cut grass and blooming roses and rich, damp earth. It smelled of innocence. "Don't you two work too hard now," I called out, my voice full of a cheerful warmth that now feels like acid in my memory. "Time for a break." I set the tray down on the white wrought-iron table under the shade of the great oak. Richard stood up, brushing the dirt from his knees. He smiled at me, a wide, easy smile that made the corners of his eyes crinkle. It was the smile he used for photographs, for church socials, for the world. It was his public face, and I was its most loyal admirer. "We're not working, my dear," he said, draping an arm around Emma's shoulders and pulling her close to his side. "We're creating beauty. Isn't that right, Songbird? Emma nodded, leaning into his side. But as she looked up at him, her lemonade glass halfway to her lips, I see it again now, another flicker. A shadow of confusion in her bright eyes as his thumb began to rub small, slow circles on her shoulder. She shifted her weight. A subtle, almost imperceptible movement to create a sliver of distance. A movement so slight that at the time I would have dismissed it as a child's fidgeting. She took a long drink of her lemonade, her eyes cast down, her sunny ebullience momentarily dimmed. "Grandpa," she said, her voice quiet, "you're squeezing a little tight." He laughed, a hearty, booming sound, and loosened his grip immediately. "Apologies, my dear. Sometimes I forget my own strength. I'm just so proud of my best girl." He winked at her, and the shadow passed. She smiled back, the moment forgotten, the discomfort smoothed over by his charisma. He refilled her glass, told a funny story about a squirrel in the attic, and her laughter, a bit forced at first, soon became genuine again. I sat with them, sipping my own lemonade, feeling a deep, placid contentment. I was the wife of a good man, the grandmother of a happy child. My world was orderly, beautiful, and safe. I was so busy polishing the frame of our perfect family portrait that I never saw the monstrous face taking shape in the canvas. I chose not to see it. That afternoon, I saw a man who loved his granddaughter. Today, in the cold, sterile air of his funeral, I see a predator teaching his prey to trust the hand that feeds it, to accept the cage because it is gilded, to love the silence because it is disguised as peace. His voice from that sun-drenched memory echoes in the funereal quiet of the present, and the funeral home, with all its living, breathing people, feels colder and emptier than ever before. That chill I felt by the window of the funeral parlour, it didn't arrive with Richard's death. It began to creep into our lives years ago, a slow, insidious frost that started the year Emma turned 14. The sun of that perfect summer afternoon had set, and the twilight that followed was long and cold. My songbird fell silent. The bright, fearless child who chased butterflies and laughed with abandon vanished, and in her place was a stranger who haunted our homier sullen, withdrawn teenager with shadows in her eyes. It happened so gradually at first that I could tell myself it was just a phase. Her grades, once pristine, began to falter. She abandoned the piano, an instrument Richard himself had taught her to play, letting it gather dust in their living room. When she visited us, she no longer bounded through the door. She would slip in quietly, find the most distant corner of the living room, and erect a wall around herself made of a book or, later, the tinny buzz of headphones. She spoke only when spoken to, and her answers were clipped, monosyllabic stones dropped into the placid pond of our conversation. I remember one Saturday, Richard had brought home a first edition of a poetry book he knew she loved. He had found it in a dusty old shop in Portland and was so proud of his discovery. I watched him approach her, where she sat curled in the armchair by the window, the very spot where I now stood watching his mourners. "Look what I found for you, Songbird," he said, his voice full of that familiar, benevolent warmth. He held out the book to her. Emma looked up, her eyes flicking from the book to his face and back down again. She took it from him, her fingers barely brushing his. "Thanks," she mumbled, not opening it, just placing it beside her on the cushion. Richard's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "Aren't you going to look inside? It's a signed copy." "Later," she said, her gaze already drifting back to the window, to the world outside our walls. "I'm tired." He stood there for a moment, the benevolent patriarch dismissed by his sullen subject. The air grew thick with his disappointment. He eventually turned away, his shoulders just a little less straight than before, and I felt a hot surge of anger, not at him, but at her. The ingratitude was a slap in the face. Richard was a busy, important man, yet he made time to think of her. to find her treasures, and she treated his affection like a burden. I saw it as a profound failure of character on her part, a teenage selfishness that needed to be corrected. My frustration wasn't born of concern for Emma's soul, but for the disruption of our family's harmony, for the pained look in my husband's eyes. The final crack appeared a few weeks later. I had called Sarah to confirm our usual Saturday dinner plans, and she had hesitated. "Evelyn," she'd said, her voice strained, "Emma is refusing to come." "Refusing? What do you mean, refusing?" She locked herself in her room. "She says she's not feeling well, but it's every week now, this same excuse. David and I don't know what to do with her." "Put her on the phone," I said, my voice hardening. This rebellion had gone on long enough. After a moment of muffled argument, Emma's sullen voice came on the line. "Hello?" I didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Emma, this is your grandmother. I expect to see you at noon. Your grandfather has been looking forward to it." There was a tense silence on the other end, filled only by her shaky breathing. "I can't," she finally whispered. I don't want to come over anymore." The words were a declaration of war. Not just against a family dinner, but against everything I had built. Everything Richard represented. It was a rejection of us, of our love, of her place in our perfect picture. "That's not an acceptable answer," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "I'm coming over. We are going to discuss this." I drove to her house in a cold fury. I found her in her bedroom, a place that was once a pink and white confection of childhood, but was now a dark cave, the curtains drawn against the afternoon light. She was sitting on the edge of her bed, hugging her knees to her chest. "All right, Emma," I said, closing the door behind me. "Tell me what this is about. Is it a boy? Are you in some kind of trouble at school? You can tell me." I was searching, casting about for any plausible, normal teenage explanation for this aberration. A boyfriend, bad grades, a fight with a friend, any of these I could understand and manage. She wouldn't look at me. She just stared at the pattern on her comforter, her jaw tight. "It's nothing. I just want to be left alone." "You are being selfish," I snapped, my patience gone. "You are part of a family, and your behavior is deeply hurtful, especially to your grandfather. He adores you. He has given you everything, and you repay him by skulking in corners and treating him like a leper. Do you have any idea how that makes him feel?" At the mention of Richard, her head shot up. Her eyes, when they finally met mine, were wide and terrifying. They were filled with a desperate, pleading panic that I had never seen before. It was the look of a trapped animal. Her voice, when she spoke, was a choked whisper. "You don't understand," she breathed, shaking her head slowly. "Please, Grandma. Please. Just don't make me go." There it was. The moment. The precipice. She was begging me for help, for rescue. She was holding out her hand from the edge of a cliff, and all I saw was adolescent melodrama. All I heard was defiance. My entire world, my 60 years of marriage to a good, respected man, my carefully constructed reality at all, rested on the belief that Richard was unimpeachable. Her plea was a threat to that foundation. If I acknowledged her terror as real, I would have to ask where it came from. And that was a question I was utterly, profoundly unwilling to face. So I did what I had been trained to do my entire life. I chose my husband. I chose the illusion. My voice became ice. "I understand perfectly. I understand that you are an ungrateful and overly dramatic young lady who is letting her family down. You are a Miller. You are a Vance. You will act like it. It is your duty to be a loving granddaughter. We will pick you up at noon on Saturday. That is the end of this discussion." I turned and walked out of the room, closing the door on her silent, desperate plea. I felt a grim satisfaction, the kind that comes from restoring order from pruning a branch that is growing wild. I had done my duty as a grandmother. I had reinforced the rules. I see now, standing here in the chill of my husband's funeral, the truth of that moment. I hadn't closed a door on a discussion. I had slammed and bolted the only escape hatch she had, and the look in her eyes that day, I finally have a name for it. It wasn't defiance. It was pure, unadulterated terror. That victory, as I had called it in my mind, the one where I'd put Emma in her place and restored order, ushered in a year of Cold War. The Saturday visits continued, as commanded, but they were hollow rituals, exercises in silent misery. Emma would appear, a ghost in her own life, and settle into her designated armchair, her face a pale, blank mask. She would answer our questions with single words, her eyes fixed on some point beyond our walls. The crack had been plastered over, but the foundation beneath was crumbling into dust. We won the battle for her attendance, but the house was filled with the suffocating silence of a defeated enemy, and we were too proud to wonder why she had surrendered. Richard, bless his patient heart, I thought at the time, tried everything. He brought her books, sheet music for songs she no longer played, a delicate silver locket she never wore. He would try to joke with her, to coax a smile from her. But his attention seemed only to make her shrink further into herself. I saw his efforts as the purest form of love, and her rejection of them as a deep, willful cruelty. My irritation with her festered into a hard, permanent resentment. She was a flaw in the perfect enamel of our lives, a constant, sullen reminder that something was wrong. And I blamed her for it with every fibre of my being. And then, one Tuesday evening in October, the silence was shattered by a single, hysterical phone call. The telephone on the hall table, usually so quiet, shrieked through the house. Richard was in his study, going over accounts. I was in the living room, needle-pointing a cushion cover. I answered on the third ring. Ah, hello? It was Sarah, but it was a version of my daughter I had never heard. Her voice was a raw, ragged thing, torn apart by sobs. Mother? Oh, God. Evelyn? Sarah? What is it? What's wrong? Is it David? My mind immediately went to a car crash, a heart attack, one of the clean, comprehensible tragedies of life. No, it's Emma, she gasped, and a fresh wave of weeping broke over her words. We were at the doctor's. She's been so tired, so sick. I thought it was anemia. Oh God, Mother. The doctor, a cold dread, slick and oily, began to seep into my bones. Sarah, calm down. Tell me what the doctor said. There was a choked, guttural sound, the sound of a woman trying to speak a word that is physically poisoning her. He said she's pregnant. The word hung in the air between us. Pregnant. It wasn't a word that belonged to our family. Not like this. It was a word for other people, for careless girls from broken homes. It was a word of shame, of failure. My hand tightened on the receiver, my knuckles white. The needlepoint I had been working on, a pattern of perfect, orderly roses, suddenly seemed like a grotesque mockery. We're coming over, I said. My voice flat and distant, as if it belonged to someone else. I hung up the phone and walked to the door of Richard's study. He looked up from his ledger, a pair of reading glasses perched on his nose, the picture of serene, intellectual calm. It's Emma, I said, and the two words were all it took. He saw my face, and the calm vanished. The drive to their house was a blur of silent dread. When we arrived, the scene was one of quiet catastrophe. David was pacing the living room floor like a caged animal, his face pale, his hands clenched into white-knuckled fists. Sarah was curled on the sofa, weeping into a cushion, her body shaking with tremors of rage and shame. How could she do this? She was muttering, over and over again. How could she do this to us? To her father? To her grandfather's name? Her grief, I realized, was entirely for herself. For the public stain this would leave on her perfect life. And Emma. Emma was sitting on the stairs, halfway between the chaos of the living room and the sanctuary of her bedroom. She wasn't crying. She was unnervingly still, her arms wrapped around her stomach in a gesture that was both protective and defensive. She was staring at a spot on the opposite wall, her expression completely vacant. It was not the look of a guilty teenager caught in a lie. It was the look of a prisoner of war, dissociated from the trauma unfolding around her, a soul that had already retreated to a place no one could reach. Then Richard walked into the room, and a masterful performance began. He did not shout. He did not rage. His face was a study in profound, controlled sorrow. He went to Sarah first, sitting beside her on the sofa, pulling her into his arms. "Shh, my dear," he murmured, stroking her hair. "We will get through this. We are a family. We will face this together." He was the patriarch, the rock, his quiet strength, a comfort in the storm of their panic. He let her cry against his shoulder, absorbing her shame, validating her pain. After a few minutes, when Sarah's sobs had subsided into shuddering breaths, he stood up and turned his attention to Emma. My heart ached for him, for this good man forced to confront such a sordid, ugly betrayal. He didn't approach her with anger. He pulled a dining chair from against the wall and placed it in front of her, sitting down so he was at her level. His movements were slow, deliberate, full of a heartbreaking gentleness. "Emma," he began, his voice low and heavy with pain. "Look at me." Slowly, reluctantly, she lifted her head, her empty eyes finally meeting his. "We're not angry," he said, a lie so beautiful it almost sounded true. "We are just so terribly hurt, so disappointed. We love you, you know that. But this is a terrible thing. We just need to understand how this happened. We need to help you. But you have to help us first." He leaned forward slightly, his expression one of pure, fatherly concern. His voice dropped even lower, becoming a conspiratorial, coaxing whisper. "We need a name, Emma. That's all. Who did this to you?" He paused, letting the question sink into the thick, silent air. Then he framed it, built a cage around it, ensuring there was only one possible answer. "Who is the boy?" The question hung in the room, heavy and suffocating. Who is the boy? It was not a question seeking an answer, so much as a command demanding a confession that fit their narrative. All eyes were on Emma. My daughter Sarah's, red-rimmed and furious. My son-in-law David's, blazing with a helpless, misdirected rage. And Richard's. Oh, Richard's eyes were the worst. They were pools of deep, theatrical sorrow, the eyes of a saint looking upon a sinner, offering a path to redemption if only she would name her accomplice. Emma's silence stretched, thin and taut, until it felt like it might snap. She hugged her knees tighter, making herself smaller, a ship pulling in its sails against a hurricane. "Emma, for God's sake, answer your grandfather." David finally exploded, his voice cracking. "Give me a name. I just need a name." Her lips trembled. She finally whispered something, a name so faint it was barely audible. "Mark." "Mark who?" Sarah pressed, leaning forward, her voice sharp as glass. "Mark Peterson," Emma mumbled, her eyes fixed on her own knees. A wave of something that felt grotesquely like relief washed through the room. A name. A tangible villain. A simple, sordid story of teenage lust. David's fists clenched. Peterson. From the hardware store. I'll kill him. I'll tear him limb from limb. We will handle Mr. Peterson, Richard said, his voice a low, authoritative calm that cut through David's rage. He turned his gentle, disappointed gaze back to Emma. When did this happen, Emma? Where? Here, her story crumbled. It was a house of cards built on a fault line. At a party, she whispered. A few months ago. Whose party? Sarah demanded. You weren't at any parties a few months ago. You were grounded. Don't you lie to us, Emma. Don't you dare. Emma's face, already pale, went ashen. She had no more words. The lie died, leaving an even more damning silence in its wake. They saw it as proof of her cunning, her treachery. She was not only promiscuous, she was manipulative, trying to protect her sordid lover. The frustration in the room curdled into something uglier. Sarah and David began to argue in sharp, hissing whispers in the corner of the room, debating what to do, their words a venomous spray of blame and panic. Richard, ever the diplomat, stood up. I think perhaps the girl needs a moment, he said softly. Evelyn, perhaps you can speak to her. Woman to woman. I'll be in the study. He gave me a look of deep, shared pain. The look of an ally in a terrible war. And then he retreated, leaving me alone with my granddaughter. He was a master strategist. He knew exactly what he was doing. I walked over and stood before Emma, who still hadn't moved from the stairs. The air between us was thick with my disappointment and her silent, suffocating terror. Why, Emma? I asked, my voice trembling with a rage I was sure was righteous. Why would you lie? Why would you protect some worthless boy who has ruined your life and shamed this entire family? She finally looked up at me. Her eyes were not empty anymore. They were filled with a desperate, final plea. It was the same look she had given me in her bedroom a year ago, the look I had dismissed as melodrama. She was on the edge of the cliff, and she was reaching for me one last time. Her voice was a ragged whisper, a sound that seemed scraped from the very bottom of her soul. Because there is no boy. What? I snapped. What are you talking about? Don't be ridiculous. Please, Grandma, she begged. And now tears, hot and real, began to stream down her pale cheeks. Please, you have to believe me. She leaned forward, her voice dropping so low I had to bend down to hear it. Her secret, a toxic, corrosive thing. It was Grandpa. The world did not tilt. It shattered. The 3 words were a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs, the strength from my limbs. For one single, horrifying instant, I saw a flash of truth, the lingering hand, the possessive nicknames, the look in his eye. A tiny, treacherous part of me knew she was telling the truth. And that knowledge was so monstrous, so world-destroying, that my entire being revolted against it. My mind, my body, my soul, 60 years of my life, rose up in a single, violent act of denial. Before I even knew what I was doing, my hand flew through the air. The crack of my palm against her cheek echoed in the silent house, a sound as sharp and final as a bone breaking. Her head snapped to the side. A bright red handprint began to bloom on her white skin. She looked at me, her eyes wide with a shock so profound it went beyond pain. My voice came out as a hiss, venomous and shaking with the force of my own terror. You disgusting, wicked little liar, I seethed. How dare you? How dare you say such a filthy, monstrous thing? You would ruin the best man I have ever known. You would burn this family to the ground, just to cover up your own cheap little sin. You are not his granddaughter. You are something dredged up from the gutter. I turned and fled, stumbling into Richard's study, my heart hammering against my ribs. He was sitting in his leather chair. A book, open on his lap, the picture of patience. He looked up, his face full of concern. "Evelyn, what is it?" "The lie," I choked out, shaking uncontrollably. "The horrible lie she told." I repeated her words, her accusation, and as I said them aloud, they sounded even more insane, more venomous. Richard did not get angry. He did something far more effective. He looked utterly and completely crushed. He closed his eyes, and a single, perfect tear traced a path down his cheek. He put his head in his hands. "How could she hate me so much?" he whispered, his voice thick with anguish. "What have I ever done but love her? To think of such a thing. It's a sickness in her mind, Evelyn. A deep, deep sickness. He had done it. With his performance of perfect wounded innocence, he had sealed her fate. He had named her sickness, and in doing so, had absolved himself completely. I was filled with a ferocious, protective love for this man, this victim of a vile, pathological slander. The family reconvened. But the mood had shifted. It was no longer a frantic interrogation. It was a cold, clinical sentencing. I had told them her lie, and it had solidified their resolve. She was not just a promiscuous girl. She was now mentally unstable, a venomous, destructive force. The discussion was no longer about who, but what. What to do with the problem. With the shame. With her. The words came quickly. A home for troubled girls. Discretion. Somewhere out of state. A closed adoption is the only way. A fresh start for the baby, with a good family. They spoke of her as if she weren't in the house. As if she were an object to be dealt with. A stain to be removed. 3 days later, it was done. A small bag was packed. An arrangement had been made with a church-run facility in Utah. There were no tearful goodbyes. We stood in the hallway. A grim tribunal of judges. Sarah, her face a mask of hard-won composure. David, his eyes cold and empty. And me, my heart a stone of righteous certainty. Emma came down the stairs. The handprint on her cheek had faded to a sickly yellow bruise. Her eyes were voids. The girl who had begged me for help was gone, and in her place was a hollow shell. She did not look at us. She walked past us, out the front door, and into the waiting car that would carry her out of our lives. We watched it pull away from the curb and disappear around the corner. We told ourselves we were saving her from a life of shame. We told ourselves we were doing the right thing for the innocent child she was carrying. We told ourselves we were protecting the family. But we weren't. We were burying our secret alive. And I was the one who had handed them the shovel. After the car carrying, Emma turned the corner. A profound silence descended upon our two houses. It was not a peaceful silence. It was the heavy, sterile quiet of a hospital room after a patient has died, an absence so complete it becomes a suffocating presence. We had excised the disease, we told ourselves. Now we could heal. But the silence that followed was the silence of the tomb. Emma's name was the first casualty. It was never spoken again. Not by Sarah or David. Not by Richard. And certainly not by me. It became a forbidden word, a shard of glass in the throat. To speak it would be to acknowledge the wound, and our entire existence was now predicated on the lie that we were unscarred. Any mention from outsiders was met with a cool, evasive response that discouraged further inquiry. "She's travelling," we'd say, or "she's finding her own way." Vague euphemisms for an exile we had enforced. I remember the first letter that arrived, about 3 months after she had gone. It was in a plain white envelope, the postmark from a small town in Utah. It was addressed to me. I was in the kitchen with Sarah, having our morning coffee in a strained, determinedly normal ritual. Sarah saw the envelope on the counter, saw the unfamiliar handwriting, saw the postmark, and her face hardened into a mask of cold resolve. She didn't say a word. She simply took the letter, tore it in two, then in four, and let the pieces flutter into the wastebasket. I met her gaze and gave a single, sharp nod of approval. It was a pact, sealed in that quiet act of destruction. We were the guardians of the silence. We would let nothing disturb it. More letters came over the next year, addressed to me or to Sarah. Each one met the same fate, their unspoken contents fueling the fiction that she was a problem that had been solved, a story that was over. With the silence firmly in place, my life narrowed into a single, focused purpose: the care and maintenance of Richard Miller. My devotion to him, already the central pillar of my life, became something more desperate, more ferocious. It was a full-time occupation, a constant, active rebuttal to the monstrous lie she had told. Every perfectly cooked meal, every immaculately pressed shirt, every flawlessly hosted dinner party was a testament to his goodness, and by extension, the righteousness of my choice. I polished his image until it gleamed with an unholy light, because if he was a saint, then I was not a monster. Our house became less of a home and more of a museum, a curated exhibit of a perfect life. The floors were always polished, the silver always gleaming, the flowers always fresh. There was no clutter, no mess, no sign of the untidy chaos of real living. It was the pristine, beautiful, and utterly lifeless shell of a home, and I was its chief curator. My days fell into a rigid, repetitive rhythm. Wake at 6. Prepare Richard's breakfast-stone soft-boiled egg. 3 minutes exactly. 2 pieces of dry rye toast. Read him the headlines from the paper while he ate. Manage his schedule of appointments and social engagements. A quiet lunch. An afternoon of errands in service of his needs. An evening spent entertaining his associates or sitting in quiet companionship while he worked. This routine was my armor. Its predictability, its endless cycle of duties, protected me from the one thing I could not bear: unstructured time, the quiet moments when a dangerous thought might find a way to surface. Richard, in turn, settled into his role as the benevolent ruler of my small kingdom. His control was never overt. He was too intelligent for that. It was a slow, gentle tightening, a masterful manipulation that framed my servitude as a noble choice. He would take my hand at a dinner party, in front of our friends, and say, "I'm a lucky man, after the unpleasantness a few years back, to have such a devoted wife. Evelyn is my rock." The guests would smile, touched by his sentiment, and I would feel a flush of pride. He was praising me, but he was also reminding me of my function, of my loyalty during the unpleasantness. He slowly pruned my life of outside connections, always under the guise of protecting me, of protecting us. "That Martha is such a gossip, dear," he'd say gently after my cousin had called. "It's probably best we keep our own counsel. People love to talk, and we must protect our privacy, now more than ever." And so, I began to avoid Martha's calls. My book club was dismissed with a sad smile. "You have so much on your plate taking care of me. And the house, my love. You don't have time for that silly club anymore, do you?" He made my world smaller, one loving suggestion at a time, until its boundaries were the walls of our house, and its sole inhabitant of any consequence was him. My dependence on him became absolute. My identity was so intertwined with his that I no longer knew where his life ended and mine began. A decade passed like this, the seasons changing through the gleaming panes of our windows, marking time in a life that had ceased to have any forward momentum. Years fell away like leaves from the willows outside. Richard grew older, his confident stride shortening, his hair thinning to a fine silver halo. His health began to fail in small, incremental ways, a touch of arthritis, a persistent cough, a weariness that sleep could not cure. And as his body weakened, my duties intensified. I was no longer just his wife. I was his nurse. My world, already small, shrank to the dimensions of his needs, to the rhythm of his medications, to the quiet hum of his oxygen machine in the corner of the bedroom. There were moments, of course. Cracks in the prison wall. Once, in a department store, I saw a young woman with hair the color of honey, trying to wrangle a small, laughing toddler. For a single, searing moment, a feeling of loss so vast and so absolute washed over me that I had to grip the edge of a display case to keep from falling. I dismissed it as sentimentality, the foolish melancholy of an old woman. Some nights, in the deep, quiet darkness of 3 a.m., the image of my hand striking Emma's face would flash in my mind, as vivid and ugly as the day it happened. I would squeeze my eyes shut and immediately begin reciting my mental to-do list for the following day. Pick up Richard's prescription, call the plumber about the leak, polish the silver before the Gables come for dinner, using the mundane litany of my routine as an anesthetic against the piercing pain of memory. But these were fleeting weaknesses. I had made my choice. I had chosen my husband, my marriage, my life. I looked at him, sleeping in the large bed we had shared for over 60 years, his breathing a shallow, ragged sound in the quiet room. And I felt a sense of grim, unshakable purpose. I had sacrificed everything for this man, for this life we had built. I was no longer Evelyn Miller, a woman with her own thoughts and desires. I was Richard Miller's wife, his nurse, his keeper. I told myself that in this service, I had found my meaning. It was the most profound lie of all. I hadn't found a purpose. I had simply forgotten, completely and utterly, what it felt like to be free. The prison I had built for myself was, above all, orderly. Its walls were made of routine, its bars forged from the predictable rhythm of Richard's needs. This order was my shield. So when Richard, in a moment of frail, sentimental fussiness 2 years before his death, asked for a photograph he remembered from our early years, I saw it as a simple task, a welcome deviation from the monotonous cycle of pills and bedpans. "It was in a silver frame, Evelyn," he'd said, his voice a reedy whisper from his mountain of pillows. Me, standing by the De Soto, before we were married. I think it's in one of the old albums in the attic. Oh, he fell asleep shortly after. A shallow, rattling slumber. The house was still, wrapped in the mid-afternoon quiet, smelling of floor polish and the faint medicinal scent that clung to everything now. The attic. I hadn't been up there in years. It felt like a safe, productive mission, a way to please him while also conquering a long-neglected corner of my domain. The pull-down stairs groaned in protest as I lowered them. Climbing into the attic was like stepping into a different time. A single beam of light from the dormer window cut through the gloom, illuminating a swirling galaxy of dust motes. The air was thick with the scent of old paper, cedar, and time itself. Furniture, from decades past, stood shrouded in white sheets, like a congregation of ghosts. Boxes were stacked everywhere, labelled in my own neat handwriting from years ago. Christmas ornaments, Sarah's school projects, winter linens. It was a physical graveyard of the life I had so meticulously curated. I found the box labelled photo albums and began sorting through them, the plastic covers cool and slick beneath my fingers. I found the picture he wanted, of a handsome, smiling young Richard, leaning against a car that gleamed with foolish, youthful pride. But as I went to put the other albums back, my foot knocked against something tucked deep in the corner, behind a stack of old National Geographic magazines. It was a hat box. It was old, covered in a pattern of faded blue flowers, the kind of thing a young woman might have used in the 50s. It felt entirely out of place among the utilitarian storage boxes. It had a small, delicate lock, green with a faint patina of rust. Curiosity, an emotion I had long since suppressed, stirred within me. This was not mine. I had never owned a hat box like it. Richard's voice echoed in my head, his gentle admonitions about privacy, about the importance of keeping our lives to ourselves. But he was downstairs, lost in his shallow sleep. Here, in this dusty repository of the past, I was alone. A sudden, defiant impulse took hold. I found an old, tarnished letter opener in a can of forgotten tools and worked its tip into the lock. With a sharp, ugly crack that sounded like a gunshot in the silence, the rusted metal gave way. I lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of yellowed tissue paper, was a bundle of letters, tied with a faded, rose-coloured silk ribbon. My hands trembled as I lifted them out. They were light, brittle. The ribbon crumbled to dust between my fingers. I unfolded the top letter. The paper was delicate, almost translucent with age, and the handwriting was an elegant, looping cursive, full of life and emotion. They were signed, "Yours, Lily, Lily." The name meant nothing to me. I began to read, a voyeur sifting through the ashes of a long-dead affair. At first, that's all it seemed to be. The passionate, secret letters of a mistress. "My dearest Richard," one began. "Last night was a dream I never wanted to wake from. The city is so grey without you in it. I felt a distant, conventional pang of jealousy, the ghost of a pain a younger wife might have felt. It was sordid, yes, but not world-shattering. Men like Richard, powerful and charismatic, often had their secrets. I kept reading, moving through the years, the tone of the letters shifting. The passion cooled into a steady, dependent affection. She thanked him for his generosity, for a loan to help her mother with medical bills, for the lovely gift he had sent. The words began to prick at my unease. Generosity. Gifts. It felt transactional. It felt familiar. I reached the last letter in the stack. It was shorter than the others, the handwriting slightly less steady. It was not dated, but the paper felt the most fragile of all. "Dearest Richard," it read, "I trust you had a safe journey home. The countryside is as quiet as you promised, and the arrangements have been made. It is for the best, I know. This difficult situation will soon be behind us, a secret sorrow that only we will have to carry. I am so grateful for your discretion, for helping me through this time when I had no one else to turn to. I will think of you always. Yours, Lily." I read the words again and again. The air in the attic grew thin, cold. The arrangements have been made. This difficult situation. Discretion. It was our code. It was the exact clinical, euphemistic language we had used for Emma. The words Sarah and I had whispered in panicked tones. The words Richard had used to calm us, to frame the solution, to orchestrate the banishment. The realization struck me not as a thought, but as a physical blow, a wave of ice water flooding my chest. This was not a unique family tragedy. This was a script, a playbook he had used before. I sat there, on the dusty floorboards of the attic, the ghost of a woman named Lily whispering her 40-year-old secret in my ear. The letters lay scattered in my lap, brittle fragments of a story I had never known existed. I thought of Emma, her terror-filled eyes, her whispered, desperate plea, my hand striking her cheek. For the very first time, the two stories, Lily's and Emma's, connected in my mind, not as separate tragic incidents, but as horrifying echoes of each other. A pattern, a method. My carefully built prison of denial, so sturdy for so many decades, had just been struck by an earthquake. Its foundations were groaning, its walls beginning to crack. And through those cracks, for the first time in a very long time, a sliver of terrifying, unbearable light was beginning to shine through. I came down from the attic, a changed woman. I placed the photograph of the young, smiling Richard on his bedside table. And when he woke, he looked at it and gave me a weak, contented smile. I smiled back. It was the first truly calculated, utterly false smile I had given him in my entire life. From that moment on, my orderly routine of care became the perfect cover for a spy. Every time I fluffed his pillows or measured his medicine, I was looking at him with new eyes. He was no longer my husband, the frail man I had served for a lifetime. He was a stranger, a man with a ghost named Lily in his past, a man who used the same soft words to orchestrate two different tragedies, 40 years apart. The letters I had found were a seed of doubt, but they were not proof. They were old, emotional, open to interpretation. My mind, so practiced in the art of self-deception, fought a desperate battle against them. Lily could have been unstable. She could have been exaggerating. I found myself clinging to these possibilities with a fierce, desperate hope. I began to search, not for evidence of his guilt, but for proof of his innocence. I needed to find a diary entry, a business record, anything that would explain away the letters and restore my world. I was desperate to be wrong. I waited for my opportunities. The 2 hours every afternoon when the visiting nurse came, freeing me to leave the house. The long, deep stretches of the night when his medication gave him something close to a peaceful sleep. I started in the closets, in the backs of drawers, sifting through old papers and forgotten boxes. I found nothing. My search, inevitably, led me to his study, his inner sanctum. It was a room I had always respected as his private domain, a place I entered only to dust or serve him coffee. It was a monument to him, floor-to-ceiling mahogany bookshelves filled with leather-bound classics he never read, a massive desk polished to a mirror shine, a faint, lingering scent of old paper, leather, and his cologne. To search this room felt like the ultimate violation, a desecration of his memory while he was still alive. I started with the desk, my heart hammering against my ribs. Each drawer I opened felt like a betrayal. I found only what I expected. Business files, checkbooks, perfectly aligned pens, all the mundane paraphernalia of a well-ordered life. There was nothing. A part of me felt a wave of relief. The other part, the new, suspicious part of me, knew that a man like Richard wouldn't be so careless. My eyes scanned the room, searching for something out of place in this temple of perfect order, and I saw it. A large oil painting of a ship at sea, one he had inherited from his father, hung on the wall behind his desk. It was almost imperceptibly crooked, a millimetre lower on one side. Richard was a man who would notice a crooked picture frame from across the street. He straightened this painting at least once a week. The fact that it was askew meant someone had moved it recently and put it back imperfectly. Or that it was designed to be moved. With trembling hands, I lifted the heavy painting from its hook. Behind it, flush with the wall, was the flat, grey steel door of a safe. I felt a chill run through me. Of course, a man with so many secrets would have a vault for them. I tried the handle, but it was locked fast by a numerical keypad. I slumped into his large leather chair, my mind racing. What would the combination be? His birthday? Too obvious. Our son's birthday? The address of the house? Then a thought, bitter and cruel, surfaced. I reached out and slowly, deliberately, punched in the 6 digits of our wedding anniversary. The date I had revered my entire life, the day I believed my true purpose had begun. There was a soft electronic beep, followed by a solid thunk as the bolts retracted. The safe was open. The irony was a physical sickness in the back of my throat. Our most sacred day, used to guard his most profane secrets. There wasn't much inside. Stacks of stock certificates, property deeds, and a single small black book tucked in the back. It was a simple cloth-bound ledger, the kind you could buy at any office supply store. It looked innocuous, boring. My hands shook so violently I could barely grasp it. I took it to the desk, opened it under the green glow of his banker's lamp, and my search for his innocence came to an end. The first several pages were what I expected: meticulous records of business expenses, stock purchases, property taxes. Then, the entries changed. The columns were labeled date, payee, expense, category, amount. The first entry that made my breath catch was from 40 years ago. Payee, L. Foster, category, gift, amount, $2,000. L. Foster, Lily Foster. I felt the floor tilt beneath me. I kept turning the pages, a cold dread building in my stomach. There were other initials: C.R., S, J, A, M. A secret history of gifts and loans spanning decades. And then I found the page I had been both searching for and dreading. At the top, in Richard's neat, controlled script, was the heading for a new year. And there, halfway down the page, were the two initials that stopped my heart: E.V., Emma, Vance. I read the entries, my mind struggling to process the cold, transactional horror of it all. The 12th of June. Payee, expense. E.V., summer camp fee. Category, family gift. Amount, $500. The 3rd of August. Payee, expense. E.V., birthday dress. Nordstrom. Category, family gift. Amount, $150. The 22nd of October. Payee, expense. E.V., piano lessons. Fall term. Category, education. Amount, $200. The grooming. The investments. All logged with the same dispassionate precision as his stock purchases. I felt a wave of nausea. My finger traced down the page, my blood turning to ice. The 19th of September. Pay, expense. Dr. Albright. Category, medical consultation. E.V. Amount, $300. The 25th of October. Payee, expense. St. Jude's Home for Wayward Youth. Category, relocation. Expense. Amount, $5,000. Relocation expense. The clinical corporate term for what he had done. For what we had done. It wasn't the cost of an adoption. It was the price of erasing a human life, logged as a business expense. The ledger slipped from my numb fingers and fell to the floor with a soft thud. I tried to breathe, but my lungs wouldn't work. The air in the room was thick, unbreathable. I slid from the heavy leather chair and collapsed onto the floor, my body convulsing with a silent, racking sob. It was all there. The cold, objective, numerical proof. Every doubt, every hope I had harbored of his innocence was annihilated. The man I had loved, served, and defended for 60 years was not a saint. He was a monster, a meticulous bookkeeping monster, who kept a detailed record of his sins. My slap, my righteous anger, my life's devotion. All of it had been in service to this. I was not just the wife of a predator. I was his chief accountant, his willing accomplice, the warden of his prison, who never thought to look at the books. And the truth of it, laid bare in that devil's ledger, was more than I could bear. I don't know how long I lay on the floor of his study, the plush wool of the rug cold against my cheek. Minutes or hours. Time had ceased to have meaning. Eventually, a cold clarity pierced through the fog of my horror. I rose to my feet, my movements stiff and mechanical, like an automaton. I picked up the ledger, placed it back inside the safe, and spun the dial. I listened for the soft thunk of the bolts locking into place. I straightened the painting of the ship at sea until it was perfectly, immaculately level. Then I turned off the lamp and walked out of the room, leaving the darkness to swallow his secrets once more. I was no longer a grieving wife or a hysterical woman. The shock had burned away every last vestige of the person I had been. In its place was a core of pure, cold ice. I knew what I had to do. I was not a wife going to her husband's bedside. I was an executioner, on her way to the condemned man's cell to hear his final confession. I entered our bedroom. The only light came from the small lamp on his nightstand, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. The air was thick with the smell of his illness and the low, rhythmic hum of the oxygen machine that was keeping him alive. He was awake, his head propped up on a mound of pillows, his breathing a shallow, ragged affair. He saw me and tried to smile, a weak, ghastly imitation of his former charisma. "Evelyn," he rasped, "is it time for my pills?" I didn't answer. I walked to his side of the bed and simply stood there, looking down at him. My silence unnerved him. The smile faltered. A flicker of something annoyance, fear, crossed his eyes. "Is something the matter, dear?" he asked. His voice strained. "You look pale." I reached into the pocket of my housecoat and took out the small black ledger. I placed it on the blanket that covered his frail, shrunken chest. It lay there between us, small and unassuming, yet heavier than a tombstone. His eyes widened almost imperceptibly. He tried to feign confusion. "What's this? My old business ledger?" "What about it, Evelyn? Have you taken up an interest in accounting in your old age?" My voice, when I spoke, was unrecognizable to me. It was flat, quiet, and utterly devoid of emotion. "I read it, Richard. All of it." I paused, letting the words settle in the suffocating quiet of the room. "I read about Lily Foster, and I read the entries for Emma." A muscle twitched in his jaw. He was a cornered animal, but he would not give up without a fight. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice a little too sharp. "You're tired. You're not thinking clearly. The strain of these past few years. Relocation expense, Richard." I cut him off, my voice as cold and sharp as a shard of ice. $5,000. Is that the going rate for destroying a granddaughter's life? I was just wondering if the price has gone up since you paid for Lily's trip to the countryside. That was it. The specific, undeniable detail. The moment he knew the game was over, I watched it happen. The mask of the frail, sick old man melted away. The feigned confusion vanished. The look in his eyes changed, the cloudy vulnerability replaced by a glint of the old, sharp, reptilian intelligence I had once mistaken for brilliance. A slow, contemptuous smile spread across his thin, dry lips. He was no longer cornered. He was triumphant. "So," he rasped, a dry, rattling chuckle in his chest. "The little mouse finally learned how to read the books. Took you long enough. 60 years of blissful ignorance. I was beginning to think you'd go to your grave without ever knowing what a truly remarkable man you were married to. I just stared, my blood running cold." "Oh, you were always so beautifully blind, Evelyn," he continued, his voice gaining a strange, new strength. "It was your most charming quality. You saw exactly what you wanted to see. The good husband, the pillar of the community, the loving grandfather. It was a lovely story, and you believed every word of it." He shifted against his pillows, a king holding court from his deathbed. "Appetites, my dear. That's all it ever was. A man has certain appetites. A lesser man is ruled by them. A greater man, a man like me, learns to manage them. It's all just logistics. A gift here, a bit of generosity there, a firm hand when necessary. Discretion. It's just bookkeeping." He coughed, a dry, rattling sound, before fixing his gleaming eyes on me again. And Emma, ah, Emma, he sighed, a sound of pure, possessive nostalgia. She was a masterpiece, a perfect little songbird, so full of trust, so eager to please. She sang the sweetest song of all. He saw the look on my face, and his smile widened into a cruel sneer. He was saving his final, most venomous truth for last. But you, my dear Evelyn, he whispered, his voice dropping to an intimate, conspiratorial hiss. You were the best part of the whole arrangement, my masterpiece of a wife. You were the perfect cage. So respectable, so unimpeachable. You polished the bars every day. You defended the door from intruders. You even struck the child for rattling it too loudly. You needed my sainthood far more than I ever did. Don't you ever, for 1 second, think you were just an innocent bystander in all this? You were the foundation upon which it was all built. He finished speaking, a triumphant, breathless rasp, and lay back against his pillows, his eyes shining with a feverish, evil light. He had confessed. He had boasted. He expected tears. He expected rage. He expected a satisfying, dramatic breakdown from the wife he had so thoroughly broken. He did not get it. I felt nothing. Not rage, not sorrow, not pain. Just a vast, cold, silent emptiness where my heart used to be. The 60 years of my life with this man collapsed into a single point of black, meaningless ash. I was not looking at my husband. I was not even looking at a man. I was looking at a thing, a monster made of pride and appetite, and in the cold, clear, empty space of my soul, I finally knew with absolute certainty what had to be done. He lay back against the pillows, a faint, triumphant smile on his lips, the last of his monstrous confession hanging in the air between us, like poison gas. He was waiting for my reaction, eager to savor the final destruction of the woman he had spent a lifetime creating. The silence in the room stretched, punctuated only by the low hum of the oxygen machine and the ragged, shallow sound of his breathing. Then, something changed. A look of confusion flickered in his eyes, replacing the evil pride. His triumphant smile slackened. His hand, thin and papery, went to his chest, clutching at the fabric of his pajamas. His breath, already so shallow, turned into a wet, gurgling choke. The colour drained from his face, leaving behind a waxy grey pallor. His eyes, the same eyes that had gleamed with possessive pride moments before, were now wide with a new primal terror. They locked onto mine, and they were screaming, "Help me!" Everything he needed was inches from my hand. On the nightstand, next to the glass of water and the lamp, was the small orange bottle of nitroglycerin pills, his emergency lifeline. Next to it was the telephone. 60 seconds. That's what the doctor had said. If he ever had an attack like this, he had 60 seconds to get a pill under his tongue before the damage became irreversible. His trembling hand left his chest and reached out towards me, towards the nightstand. It was a desperate, pleading gesture. His mouth opened, but only a strangled, clicking sound came out. And I did nothing. I stood there, a statue carved from ice, and watched him. My body was frozen, but my mind was a whirlwind. The 60 years of our life together played out in 60 seconds of agonizing clarity. Tick. I saw Emma's face, 14 years old and terrified, her voice a whisper. "Please, Grandma, don't make me go." Tick. I heard the sharp, ugly crack of my own hand striking her cheek. My own voice hissing with righteous fury. "You disgusting, wicked little liar!" Tick. I saw the faded, elegant handwriting of a ghost named Lily. "This difficult situation will soon be behind us. A secret sorrow only we will have to carry." Tick. I saw the cold, neat columns of his devil's ledger, the initials, the numbers, EV, relocation expense, $5,000. He was still looking at me, his eyes bulging, his face turning a deep, terrifying shade of purple. He was drowning on dry land, and I was the only lifeguard on the shore. My hand felt impossibly heavy, welded to my side. I was the judge, the jury, and in this quiet, dimly lit room, I was the executioner. My inaction was my verdict. Tick. The frantic, clawing motions of his hands began to slow. The guttural, choking sound in his throat lessened, fading into a wet, rattling sigh. Tick. The terror in his eyes began to glaze over, replaced by a dull, vacant surprise. The light, the intelligence, the evil, it was all just going out, like a candle flame being slowly snuffed. Tick. His hand fell from the air and landed on the blanket with a soft, final thud. His body gave one last, shuddering convulsion. And then he was still. The silence that followed was absolute. The rhythmic hum of the oxygen machine now seemed obscenely loud, a pointless noise in a room where breath was no longer needed. The clock on the wall ticked on, indifferent. I stood there for another full minute, my eyes fixed on the still figure in the bed, ensuring the performance was truly over. Then I took a deep, steadying breath. My heart was calm. My hand, which had been so heavy moments before, was now light and steady as I reached for the phone. I dialed 911. When the operator's voice came on the line, calm and professional, I shattered into 1,000 pieces. My voice was a choked, hysterical sob, a flawless performance of a terrified, grieving wife. "My husband!" I cried, the fabricated panic tearing through my voice. Oh God, I think he's had a heart attack. He isn't breathing, he was just talking to me and then he just stopped. Please, you have to hurry, please send someone." I followed the operator's instructions, my voice breaking and catching at all the right moments. I collapsed into a chair, letting the phone drop from my hand as if I had no strength left. The act was complete. I had not touched him. I had not harmed him. I had simply watched him die. I had let his own monstrous truth be the poison that stopped his heart. I had let his final judgment be the silence of the woman he had tried so hard to silence herself. And the quiet in the room that followed was, for the first time in 60 years, a quiet of my own making. There was no triumph on my face, no satisfaction in my soul, just a vast, profound, and terrible emptiness. The deed was done. The week that followed Richard's death was a masterful performance. I played the part of the grieving widow with an authenticity that startled even myself. I accepted condolences, listened to endless praise for my sainted husband, and allowed my hand to be held by well-meaning friends who told me how strong I was. They didn't know that my strength was not born of grief, but of a terrible, cold clarity. The funeral, which I had dreaded from the moment I found the ledger, became my stage. I was flawless. Now, a week later, came the final act of his life, the reading of the will. The three of us, myself, Sarah, and David, sat in the stuffy, wood-panelled office of Richard's lawyer, a man named Mr. Abernathy, whose face seemed permanently fixed in an expression of mild disapproval. The air smelled of old paper, leather, and dust. Sarah and David, their public performance of mourning now concluded, were visibly relaxed, expectant. I could see the calculations already happening behind their eyes. The shame and inconvenience of the last 2 decades were about to be compensated. The inheritance would be their reward, the balm that soothed all wounds. They saw it as the closing of a painful chapter and the beginning of a comfortable, well-funded future. They still believed they were the children of a difficult but ultimately benevolent patriarch. Mr. Abernathy cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the silent room. He put on a pair of gold-rimmed spectacles and began to read from the thick document in a dry, dispassionate monotone. "I, Richard Thomas Miller," he began, "being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament. I have always held that the traditional family is the bedrock of our great nation, a sanctuary of loyalty, moral rectitude, and unwavering support. It is within the family that our character is forged and our legacy secured." I listened to the hypocritical preamble without flinching. Legacy. Character. Richard was polishing his own statue even from beyond the grave. Sarah shifted in her seat, a small, impatient smile playing on her lips. She was waiting for the numbers. Mr. Abernathy turned a page. "Therefore, in consideration of these deeply held beliefs, and after a lifetime of observing the choices and character of those closest to me, I have made the following bequests." He paused, adjusted his glasses, and continued. "To my beloved wife, Evelyn, I leave my sincerest gratitude for her 60 years of service. To my daughter, Sarah Vance, and her husband, David, I leave my profound and unending disappointment." The air in the room went still. Sarah's smile vanished, replaced by a mask of stunned disbelief. David's face began to flush, a deep, mottled red. Mr. Abernathy, oblivious or indifferent to the sudden frost in the room, read on. "As my family has proven itself incapable of upholding the values of loyalty and integrity that I hold most dear, I have concluded that my life's work and fortune would be squandered in their hands. Therefore, I hereby bequeath the entirety of my estate, including all properties, stocks, bonds, and liquid assets to a worthier cause." He took a slow breath before delivering the final, killing blow. "The full remainder of my estate is to be transferred in its entirety to the National Foundation for Moral Fortitude and the Preservation of the American Family." A strangled gasp escaped Sarah's lips. "What?" "He can't do that," David sputtered, half rising from his chair. "That's everything. The house, the savings, everything. We're his family." Mr. Abernathy looked up from the will, his expression unchanged. "I assure you, Mr. Vance, the will is perfectly legal and has been certified as ironclad. Your father-in-law was very specific in his instructions. He had the detached air of a man delivering a weather report." The room erupted. Sarah was on her feet, her voice a shrill cry of outrage. "This is insane. It's a joke. After everything we went through, after all the shame she brought on us, he does this. He punishes us. Through it all." I sat perfectly still, my hands folded calmly in my lap. I was not surprised. I had stared into the face of the monster, heard his final boastful confession. I had expected one last blade, one final act of posthumous cruelty. I just hadn't known what shape it would take. He had used his last breath to position himself as a martyr, a man so wounded by his family's failings that he had no choice but to disinherit them. He had weaponized his wealth to deliver one final, public humiliation. Sarah spun on me, her face contorted with fury. "Mother, say something. Why are you just sitting there? Aren't you outraged?" I looked at my daughter, at her face full of shock and greed and wounded pride, and I felt nothing but a distant pity. She was still shocked because she still believed she was dealing with a disappointed father. I knew we were dealing with a monster who always, always had to have the last word. "There is nothing to say, Sarah," I said, my voice quiet and calm. "The will is read. It is done. They thought he had won. They thought he had left us all, especially me, with nothing but a house full of ghosts and a name steeped in hypocrisy. But Richard, for all his meticulous planning, had made one crucial oversight. He had forgotten about the small amounts, the tiny discrepancies, the weekly budget for the household that I had managed for 60 years. For 60 years I had been the keeper of the accounts. And almost every week, for the last 40 of them, I had skimmed a little off the top. A few dollars here, 10 there. My mad money, I had called it. My secret fund. I never knew what I was saving for, what I was escaping from. I only knew that some deep, primal instinct told me to build a lifeboat, even when I believed I was safe on the grandest ship in the world. We walked out of the lawyer's office into the bright, indifferent afternoon. Sarah was weeping with rage. David was cursing under his breath. They were defeated, their futures incinerated by the final, cruel whim of a dead man. I, however, felt a strange, quiet lightness. The will wasn't Richard's final victory. It was the last chain breaking. He had taken everything he thought he controlled, leaving me, he presumed, destitute and helpless. But he had left me with the one thing that mattered. He had left me with my freedom, and my lifeboat was ready. I did not go back to the house with Sarah and David. I watched them drive away from the lawyer's office in their own car, their angry, betrayed faces a portrait of ruin. I walked. It was a crisp autumn afternoon, and the streets of Havenwood, the streets I had walked for over 60 years, looked alien to me, like a set from a play whose run had ended. When I arrived back at the house, I did not enter as its mistress. I entered as a stranger, a trespasser. The silence inside was different now. It was no longer Richard's oppressive, controlling quiet. It was just emptiness. I walked through the rooms, my footsteps echoing on the polished hardwood floors. I looked at the heavy furniture, the silver-framed photographs of a smiling, lying family, the crystal vases, the porcelain figurines. They were props, set dressing for a 60-year performance. I felt no attachment to any of them. I went upstairs to the bedroom and pulled a single old suitcase from the top of the closet. I packed only what was necessary, a few changes of practical clothes, my toiletries, the sturdy, comfortable shoes I wore for gardening. I went to my jewelry box and looked at the pearls, the diamond earrings, the gold bracelets Richard had given me over the years, trophies, payments for services rendered. I closed the lid and left it on the dresser. The only thing of value I took from that room was the black ledger, which I wrapped in a sweater and placed at the very bottom of the suitcase. My last stop was not at Richard's bank, but at a small, quiet credit union on the other side of town, a place he would have considered beneath him. I had opened an account there 40 years ago, after the first time he had dismissed an opinion of mine with a condescending pat on the head, with a key that had lain hidden in my sewing box for decades. I opened a safe deposit box Richard never knew existed. Inside, it was not a vast fortune, but it was mine. Stacks of cash, bound in paper bands, yellowed and smelling of time. A few savings bonds purchased in my name only. It was the tangible result of 1,000 small rebellions, of every dollar skimmed from the grocery budget, every corner cut on household expenses. It was my lifeboat, and it was finally time to set sail. The next morning, I drove out of Havenwood, not even glancing in the rearview mirror. An hour later, in the next town over, I found the office of a private investigator. He was a quiet, tired-looking man named Mr. Graves, with kind eyes and an air of professional discretion. "I am looking for my granddaughter," I said, my voice steady. I did not offer a story or an explanation. I gave him the facts. Her name is Emma Vance. She was born on May 12th. Some years ago, she was sent to a facility called St. Jude's Home for Wayward Youth in Ogden, Utah. I pushed a plain white envelope across the desk. "This is a retainer. Your fee will be paid in cash." "Well," he nodded, not asking the questions I could see forming in his eyes. He simply took the envelope. "I will begin immediately. I'll call you on this number when I have news." I walked out of his office and got back into my old reliable Buick. The car was 15 years old, but the engine was sound. It was the one major purchase I had ever insisted upon. against Richard's desire for something more ostentatious. It was mine. As I merged onto the highway, heading east toward the high desert, I felt as though I was driving out of a long grey fog. The pilgrimage had begun. The road was a ribbon of black asphalt unfurling across a landscape of sagebrush and wide, empty skies. For 2 days I drove. The car was a cocoon, a silent, moving vessel for my thoughts. I was not driving to beg for forgiveness. I knew with a certainty that was as hard and clear as glass that I did not deserve it. Forgiveness was a gift to be given, not a debt to be collected. I was driving toward an act of testimony. My entire life had been a lie, and the only thing of value I had left to offer my granddaughter was the truth, unvarnished and terrible. The black ledger sat on the passenger seat beside me, a silent, malevolent companion. Its weight seemed to pin the car to the road. It was the proof. It was the confession. It was the weapon that had been used against her, and now it was the only offering I could bring. What would she do with it? I didn't know. Would she burn it? Would she weep? Would she throw it in my face and slam the door? All of those outcomes were hers to choose. My role was simply to deliver the evidence. On the evening of the second day, I was in a drab motel room in a small town in Idaho, the air smelling of stale cigarettes and disinfectant. My phone rang. It was Mr. Graves. "I found her, Mrs. Miller," he said, his voice professional and flat. My breath caught in my throat. "Where is she?" "Living in Portland, Oregon. Has been for about 10 years. Her name is still Emma Vance. She manages a small bookstore in the Hawthorne district." He paused. "There's more. She has a son. He's 16. 16. The word hit me with the force of a physical blow. Richard's son. A living, breathing continuation of his crime. A boy who was now almost a man. A boy who had a right to know the truth of his own story. My mission, which had felt so clear, suddenly became infinitely more complex, infinitely more painful. Mr. Graves gave me the address of the bookstore and her apartment. I wrote it down on the back of the motel room stationery, my hand shaking. I hung up the phone and stared at the address for a long time. Portland. I had driven east, away from the coast, only to be pulled back. The journey was not a straight line. It was a circle, closing in on its beginning. An abstract pilgrimage now had a concrete destination. I looked at the suitcase on the other bed, at the slight bulge where the ledger lay wrapped in my sweater. The journey was almost over. The reckoning was about to begin. Portland. I whispered into the darkness of the cheap motel room. The name was no longer a city. It was a judgment. And I was driving straight into it. The drive west into Portland was a journey into slate-grey skies and a steady, cleansing rain. The city was not a welcoming sight. It was a dense, indifferent landscape of concrete and steel, the final destination on my map of shame. I found the address in the Hawthorne district, a street lined with old, proud trees and modest, slightly worn apartment buildings. I parked my Buick across the street from a 3-story brick building that looked exactly as Mr. Graves had described it. Slightly run down, but clean and respectable. I turned off the engine. The only sound was the rhythmic thump-thump of the windshield wipers and the quiet thrum of my own heart. I sat there for a long time, perhaps an hour, my hands resting on the steering wheel, my gaze fixed on the door to the apartment building. The black ledger sat on the passenger seat, its presence a cold, heavy weight. This was it. The end of the road. There was no more running, no more hiding, no more time. My entire life, the lies, the choices, the terrible silence, had all funneled down into this single moment, into the simple act of knocking on a door. Finally, I took a deep breath, the air tasting of rain and resolution. I picked up the ledger, tucked it under my arm, and got out of the car. Each step I took across the wet pavement felt momentous, irreversible. I walked into the building's small, dim lobby. The air inside smelled of damp carpets, old dust, and the faint, lingering scent of someone's dinner. I climbed the 2 flights of stairs, my hand gripping the wooden banister, my legs feeling unsteady beneath me. I found the door at the end of the hall. Apartment 3B. Emma's door. I stood before it, my heart a frantic bird in my chest. This was the final precipice. I could still turn around, walk back down the stairs, drive away, and let the secrets die with me. It would be the easier path, the coward's path, the path I had taken my entire life. But the woman who had driven here from Havenwood was not the same woman who had lived there. I had not come all this way for myself, not for absolution or to ease my own conscience. Atonement was not about feeling better. It was about doing better, even if it was 60 years too late. I was here to bear witness. I was here to deliver the one thing she was ever owed. The truth. I raised my hand, my knuckles bony and ancient, and knocked. The sound was small, but it echoed in the silent hallway like a gavel falling. I waited. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then, I heard the sound of a bolt sliding, and the door opened. A woman stood there. A woman in her early 30s with tired, wary eyes and hair the colour of faded honey. She was wiping her hands on a dish towel. For a second, she looked at me with the polite, blank curiosity one affords a stranger. Then, I saw a flicker of recognition in her eyes, a confused frown, followed by a wave of pure, undiluted shock that washed all the colour from her face. Her hand holding the towel fell to her side. She knew me. "Mom, who is it?" a voice called from inside the apartment. A young man, a boy of about 16 with a shock of dark hair and his mother's wary eyes, appeared behind her. He looked from my strange, old face to his mother's stunned one, his expression clouding with confusion. He was tall, lanky, on the cusp of manhood, and in the set of his jaw, in the shape of his eyes, I saw Richard. It was like being stabbed with a shard of ice. He was the living, breathing consequence. The last chapter of Richard's secret ledger. Emma took a half-step back, a small, instinctive retreat, her body becoming a shield in front of her son. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. I did not cry. I did not beg. I did not offer excuses. My time for words like that had passed decades ago. My hands trembling slightly, I held out the small, black ledger. It was the only thing I had to say what a lifetime of apologies could not. My voice, when I finally found it, was a quiet, raspy thing, the voice of an old woman who had run out of lies. "Emma," I said. Her name felt foreign and holy on my tongue. "There are things you need to know. Things I should have told you a long, long time ago." I took a shaky breath and spoke the truest words of my entire life. I was wrong. I held the book out to her, an offering of truth, a testament to a crime, a confession in my husband's own hand. The camera of my memory zoomed in on her face. I saw the storm of emotions that passed over it in a matter of seconds. The raw shock, the deep, ancient pain that rose from some locked place inside her, flooding her eyes. The flicker of pure, hot anger. And then, something else. Something I hadn't expected. A crack in the hard wall of her composure. A flicker of profound, unbearable curiosity. Her eyes dropped from my face to the black book in my hands. I had not come seeking forgiveness. I had come to offer a confession. I had delivered the truth to her doorstep. A heavy, ugly, belated inheritance. What she would do with it, whether she would slam the door in my face or take the first, tentative step into the light, was not my story to write. It was hers. And for the first time, her story was finally, truly her own.